And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by ABSA Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025. Good evening. Welcome to the program. I'm Stephen Grootes. Neil Froneman's someone who's played such an interesting and important role in our mining industry. It's not just what he's done with Sibanye-Stillwater. He's someone who you kind of knew would, if necessary, be able to stand up to government. He would say things. He would appear certainly to do things. And certainly his conversations, his public conversations, spats would be the sort of word political journalists would use, with Gwede Mantashe, the Minister of Mineral and Petroleum Resources, sometimes really got to the heart of some of the problems the industry was having with the minister, with policy, with all of the other things that were going on. And I realized there was the furore over his pay packet in 2021. What was it? 290 million rand, I think it was, which was really based on shares. But still, I think that South African mining will remember him for being a straight talker. He's not done yet, of course. He only steps down at the end of September. We'll hear from Bernard Swanepoel in just a moment, someone who's played his own role in our mining industry, what he thinks of him and how he sort of describes Neil Froneman. But just interesting to sort of see how this plays out. And there was a time when some of the mines owned by Sibanye-Stillwater were not really seen as, sort of viable for much longer. But Froneman found a way to make them work. I've been struck by the, not quite drip reporting, but in Parliament, and because so many other things have been going on, it's almost been kind of on the back burner. But the stories around corruption at Eskom, and I've tried to put it into kind of three parts. You've got scores of workers who basically managed to manipulate contracts. They've got kickbacks from sort of smaller contracts at some of the power stations. And the key giveaway, and this is such a sort of government thing, is that the contracts were being done at night. The deals were being done at night. Now, when you see a government worker in the office after hours, it's like when you see some deals done at one point over the Christmas period. Whenever you see that, as a journalist, I immediately start to sort of want to have a look around and want to read those deals. So you've got that. The SIU said that around R1 billion could have been stolen from Eskom. Over 300 workers at Eskom had financial links to vendors. I mean, that's just unbelievable. And then you've got the prepaid tokens, illegal prepaid tokens being created. And on the face of it, I mean, you might hear all of that and think, well, geesh, corruption kind of defines Eskom. You have to remember the size of it. It is just massive. It's a large number of people. But still, we'll speak to Chris Yelland in a few moments and just ask him the question, how much of this corruption has led to maybe not higher increases in terms of what you pay for electricity, because NERSA has been running that, but certainly higher demands from Eskom. I think that could be really important. Good to hear from you this evening on 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567. Your voice notes this evening as well on 072 702 1702. Have you ever seen a Krugerrand? I've been trying to think about it. I think when I was a kid, I remember someone once sort of saying, come and look at my father's Krugerrand. I don't know. I can't remember if we got far enough to actually see it. It would have been a long time ago in the sort of early 80s. But have you ever seen one? And I realize it's a way to own gold. And often you can't actually handle gold. You can't sort of take it and keep it in your room. But Krugerrands you can, sort of. And we'll talk a bit more about them in the next little while. I think there's a lot to sort of look at around Krugerrands. But your story of Krugerrands, are they really a wise investment? Voice notes coming through this evening on 072 702 1702.
702. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
A statement on SENS today from Sibanye-Stillwater. Neil Froneman, going to retire at the end of September, is 65, has led the company really from its creation. There were those three mines formerly owned by the Goldfields Group and really made it into what it is now. Along the way, also spending some of the money they made from gold into platinum. And despite the weakness in the platinum market, may well be an important long-term bet. Bernard Swanepoel is a former mining CEO himself, made his own contribution, played his own role in our mining industry. Bernard, good evening, and thank you for your time. How would you sum up the career of Neil Froneman? Bernard Swanepoel, are you? Bernard, sorry, we lost you there for a second. How would you sum up the career of Neil Froneman?
Let's try again. Hopefully the line is better. I obviously think of him as a company builder, a very successful entrepreneur in the mining space, a great leader of people, and since him and I started working together over 30 years ago. I've obviously become a friend of his, but I also think of him as a real one of the critical people in our industry in the last 30 years. His contribution cannot be underestimated. He's played a significant role in the transformation of the industry. He saved mines, he's extended lives of mines. It's the end of an era, a very great career.
When he took over the 3 mines that really were the basis for Sibanye-Stillwater, it seemed they didn't have long to go. He extended their lives. He was able to move into other things. How was he able to do that?
I would, of course, claim he got taught some of those things at Harmony, but that's only a half tongue-in-cheek. He was with me at Harmony when that was exactly what we did, so he was an expert in that area. And I would say what he did at Lonmin was even more spectacular. That was really a basket case of assets, and it continues to produce well in the hands of Sibanye-Stillwater. I think it's a specific approach. Neil is an engineer with a financial qualification. He converted into a mining qualification. He brings the whole package of skills, and he's a popular leader. He gets people to want to do what he wants them to do by inspiring them. So I think he's like a successful rugby captain. He could make people walk through walls, in order to succeed. And, in the mining industry, that's always a great leadership attribute.
It makes you wonder, he's been able to turn some of these companies, some of these mines around. It makes you wonder if, even though he's retiring, he might find 1 or 2 challenges. People, I'm sure, are going to say to him, come and help us out here, come and help us out there.
I will be surprised if that's not the case. And his skills are clearly applicable to the whole world, He will be on board, I have got absolutely no doubt. But to be fair, he also deserves a retirement and a rest. So that will be up to him and his family to decide. But I will be surprised if this is the last year of Neil Froneman.
One of the hallmarks, one of the reasons that journalists quite enjoy him, Bernard, and you'll know about this, is that, he's very honest. He said bluntly once South Africa is practically a failed state. Just last week, he was criticizing the Mineral Resources Minister, Gwede Mantashe. Mantashe has been critical of him in the past. Is that one of his strengths? A lot of people in corporate South Africa and maybe in mining South Africa are a little nervous about speaking the truth to politicians in that way.
I think the rest of the captains of industry are more guilty than us miners. Neil is good value for money. The Joburg Indaba, when you get Neil to speak, he sets a tone, and quite honestly, even our minister, Gwede Mantashe, responds quite well to that. But that was certainly a part of who he was. He spoke his mind, but he was well considered. And listen, he's so patriotic to South Africa. He's so passionate about mining. So at least you always knew that whatever Neil Froneman said, he meant. And it came from a place of meaning well. He was never malicious. So I personally always took his criticism as coming from somebody who cares about the country and the industry.
He's sort of going off into the sunset in a way, although I'm sure there are other challenges ahead for him. The way in which he led, are there other people you can see who might fill that gap, or does he sort of define an era?
Well, I obviously am a bit biased that him and I really grew up together in the mining industry. But there are fantastic people to take over from him now. Internally, he's grown some timber, in the company. I will not be surprised to see that, there's succession planning as well in hand. And in the industry, you must just interact with the 30-year young mining leaders, and you'll see perhaps the industry is more ready for the young people than what we think, and they are there. I'm very optimistic about Sibanye's future under the next leadership and the industry at large.
Bernard Swanepoel, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Former mining CEO himself on the career, for the moment at least, of Neil Froneman. I get a sense, I agree with Bernard, it's not over yet.
The Money Show on 702.
Monday to Friday, 6 to 8 p.m.
Well, over the last few days, a series of sort of updates, sessions in Parliament about the situation at Eskom. Parliament hearing this week a probe into procurement fraud found that scores of workers were paid over 180 million rand in kickbacks from contracts at some power stations. The head of the Special Investigating Unit, Andy Matibi, saying R1 billion could have been stolen from Eskom. There are 300 people working at Eskom who have financial links to companies doing business with Eskom. There are other investigations that over the last couple of days that there was the illegal creation of prepaid tokens, which basically would allow people to sort of use electricity for free, steal electricity to be more accurate. Chris Yelland is an energy analyst and managing director at EE Business Intelligence. Chris, there's a lot, good evening to you. There's a lot going on here. But if you sum up this picture, it looks like a lot of money is being stolen from Eskom and stolen by its own people in a multitude of different ways.
That's right. It is, disheartening to hear about these ongoing, corruption, procurement fraud, what we call ghost vending, which is really a counterfeiting operation. It's a counterfeit operation of prepaid tokens to buy electricity. And there is a whole ecosystem feeding off Eskom in numerous ways. And you're right, a lot of it, stems from within the Eskom, but not only from within the Eskom, because, the ecosystem extends well beyond Eskom. But just taking, this conflict of interest, people at Eskom having different companies and feeding their companies with, wrongful procurements, etc. But the bigger issue, much bigger than that, because it was reported at about 180 million today, I think it was. But much bigger than that is this counterfeit operation on prepaid meters. And, I did a little estimation just for myself, because Eskom announced recently that they had 1.8 million prepayment meters that were not vending legal electricity. Okay, they're still vending electricity from these counterfeit tokens, but not legal stuff. And if you take 1.8 million meters, multiply that by 500 kilowatt hours per month, which is the typical of a low-income house, multiply by 12 months a year, and multiply by 250 per kilowatt hour, you'll come to 27 billion rand. That is the size of the ecosystem out there. That is the size of it. I mean, in rough figures. And that is the amount that Eskom is losing on revenue. And that is the amount that customers are footing the bill for, because ultimately, these things get passed through to the customer in the tariff. So, that's the big stuff as far as I can see. But that doesn't justify the smaller stuff, and 180 million is not small, but it's small by comparison with 27 billion.
So, this would suggest then, to create these tokens, it's a group of people. Obviously, it's networks, probably several groups of people. They also have to have access to Eskom's internal systems, I presume.
I would imagine, and certainly the Auditor General in his report to Parliament recently indicated that these are high-level personnel with high security clearance, with access to the encryption methodology for the creation of tokens. This is not a trivial matter, not a trivial, it's not just a printing operation. You have to have access to the encryption technology, and this requires high-level access. And of course, there must be big money in this, to be able to sell, this encrypted tokens, and then that spawns the whole ecosystem down to the actual people who sell the tokens illegally. So there's a whole ecosystem of people out there, but it seems to, according to the Auditor General, stem from a high level.
How did it get like this? And I realize that the management of Eskom have probably, and I understand this, been focused literally on generation for the last little while. Obviously, that's no excuse. They're supposed to manage something. But this has probably been going on for quite a long time. Hard to know exactly when it started. What I'm getting to is it might actually, despite what we know, despite what you've told us, still be quite difficult to stop.
Yes, indeed. So look, I've thought about this carefully, about why is it coming out now? And a few observations on my side are as follows. First of all, Eskom has been ring-fenced into generation, transmission, and distribution, whereas previously it was one amorphous organization, and therefore difficult to see where the costs and the fraud was happening and where the money was going, etc. But, distribution as a business is quite a lot smaller than generation. And now all of a sudden you have separate ring-fenced financials for each of these organizations. Now, a 27 billion rand fraud within a much smaller organization like the Eskom distribution it stands out like a sore thumb. You can't ignore it anymore, and you can't hide it anymore. But to also answer your question, there is no doubt this has been going on for years, and I'm still struggling to understand. I mean, we know that this came about recently when Eskom was updating the software of their prepayment meters, and this is when they announced this. But, they've got all the tools at their disposal to detect meters that are having unusual consumption patterns. I mean, if you're a customer that is actually using no electricity, the software flags this and says, there's a meter, there's a problem. It's either being bypassed or it's not working or it's being fraudulently fed with ghost tokens or, these counterfeit tokens. But the point is, there are these tools that all the prepayment meter operators have got to detect this stuff, yet it's been going on for years. So I think the fact now that they are unbundling is making this problem impossible to ignore any longer.
Thank you very much indeed. Chris Yelland, Energy Analyst, Managing Director at EE Business Intelligence. Frightening when you think about what it all adds up to.
The Money Show.
The markets.
David Shapiro is the Chief Global Equity Strategist at Sasfin. David, nice to talk to you again. Good evening. Neil Froneman, Sibanye-Stillwater's shares down on the day. Does show you that a CEO can still matter on the JSE?
It's rather unusual. I thought there'd be more of a reaction. They're very slightly down, and I think the market took it in its stride. I'm still trying to work out, Stephen, whether or not you've made money out of Sibanye over the years, over the last 10 or 12 years. And certainly over the last 10 years, you're down. So I'm trying to work out what his legacy is because, he took 3 defunct gold mines and he just wanted to take as much as he could out of them, pay big dividends. And then the whole company transformed into this platinum business, with Impala and then Lonmin and then Stillwater and quite a few other acquisitions. So I'm looking at the chart as I speak to you. So, well, this has been up and down all over the place. I like Neil. He's good value for money. He's very forthright in his views. But I was trying to say, how much did we make out of this?
Interesting. I've been fascinated by how there's a lot going on. Some of it against South Africa. You'd think, we've never had a US president talk about us in this way that I can remember. And yet the JSE record high yesterday, just a little bit below that today. Obviously global markets are strong, so that's helping, but still.
It's very interesting because it is happening at the top end of the market. I'm looking at Richemont today, which is now the second biggest company on the JSE in terms of market cap. It's a 2.3 trillion rand business. That was up 3.5%. We've seen, I think one of the mysteries of this year has been the recovery in luxury goods, in luxury shares. We thought it would be down, but they're all showing a lot of form. And it's been Richemont that came out with the first set of results that are far better than we thought. So very good gains in there. We've seen our miners, the top end of the miners doing well. Naspers process also up. But so that's where the gains have been made. If we go down, Stephen, into banks and retailers, they've been under pressure. They had a very good 2024, but it hasn't been sustained. I still think there are concerns about the underlying economy, and perhaps it's a year in which the earnings have to catch up with some of the share prices. But, from an broader investment, yes, we're at new highs, we're holding there. And if you look at the US markets today, also ignoring the inflation numbers that came out yesterday, ignoring the fact that we're not going to see rate reductions, Still very strong numbers there, and it's another good day in the US. So overall, global markets, doing well despite having to deal with Trump's outbursts every day or new executive orders. I think we're just getting used to it. Exhausted, but getting used to
it. David, when we spoke late last year, you and I, on the Money Show, and I haven't listened back to it, but my memory suggests that you were incredibly optimistic about the future. Interest rates were just beginning to come down. The cycle had turned. We were at the time expecting more interest rates from the US sort of in the first half of the year than I think we're going to get. Are you still as optimistic? I mean, much has changed. DeepSeek came out and changed valuations for AI. Trump's executive orders, tariff is the best word in the English language, all of those things. Are you still as optimistic?
I am optimistic, but for different reasons. I think we were all disappointed in December when when Powell said, well, not so fast. We've done 1% now, but not going to happen. And it did knock the markets. But where the transformation is coming, where my optimism is coming, I thought there'd be a slowdown in AI and artificial intelligence and the spend. In fact, it's accelerating far greater than we thought it would, despite the fact of, DeepSeek. In fact, all that's doing is creating more energy in the market, as we've seen in the Chinese market with the growth in Alibaba. So I think that's going to be the big driver. Just saddle up, get on the horses and ride this wave, the Magnificent Seven. That was a mixed metaphor, I'm sorry. But I mean, it's the amount of spending that we're seeing out of these businesses, Amazon, Alphabet, etc., is just going to keep it going. And the technology is advancing at such a rate that it's almost impossible to keep up. So that's where the drive is coming. We thought it would be interest rates, but it's still going to be in the tech area that we're going to see these gains.
David Shapiro, good to talk to you. Thank you so much. Chief Global Equity Strategist at Sasfin.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes.
18 minutes now to 7 the time. Good to hear from you tonight on 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567. Plenty coming up in the next little while, by the way. We'll be looking at the situation, and it's been fascinating to watch how a politician, Donald Trump, comes into power in the United States as president, and suddenly you have big changes in all sorts of different ways. So, for example, some companies stop talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some seem to almost back away from climate commitments, things like that. It is World Radio Day, by the way, and the fact that you listen tells me that you know that. But the way in which you listen has changed. And don't for a second think that we don't actually know that. We absolutely do. We'll talk about that a little bit after 7 o'clock. And then don't forget, from 7:30 this evening, Investment School tonight, we'll be looking at how to survive all the turmoil around the US President Donald Trump. But good to hear from you on 011 883 0702 021 446 0567. Neil Froneman is retiring. What are you doing in your retirement? I mean, some thoughts for him if he does actually, finally get the watch and move off. What are you doing in your retirement that you're enjoying?
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app
and DSTV channel 856.
Well, over the last couple of months, quite a big change, it seems, by some international asset managers on their public attitude to climate change. Companies like BlackRock in the US, South African firms like Old Mutual, 91, they'd all signed up to the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. The point was, they were saying they would invest in a way that would not lead to climate change. As far as I know, Old Mutual and 91 both still there. BlackRock and some others have moved away from it. Tracy Davies is Executive Director at Just Share. Tracy, good evening. No coincidence, is it? Some of these companies have moved away from this just after a change of guard at the White House.
No coincidence at all. You mentioned the many companies backtracking from their diversity initiatives in the wake of Donald Trump's antagonism to such. And we're seeing that also very clearly in the climate change space. At the moment, predominantly in America, with pretty much all of the major asset managers, institutional investors in America saying that they will no longer be part of these climate change-related initiatives that were set up to really help the financial sector mitigate climate risk.
Does that mean they're actually changing their investment decisions? I mean, the whole point of it was to basically say in public, we will invest in a way that doesn't harm the climate. Just because you're no longer saying it in public doesn't mean you're not still doing it.
No, that is true, but unfortunately, a lot of the, a lot of the membership kind of impacts of being a member of those initiatives haven't been as good as or as big as they should have been. They're all voluntary initiatives with voluntary commitments. And, there's some argument that, unfortunately, being part of those initiatives allowed those entities to kind of say they were doing something about climate change, but actually they hadn't really changed much in their underlying portfolios or in their approach to investing as a whole. So, as you say, we could be seeing a new era of what is called climate hushing, which is where corporates do take climate action, but they don't say that they're doing it because they don't want to encounter political backlash. But I think that the more likely situation is that we no longer have the greenwash, that they will do what they were doing anyway, but without having to kind of pretend that they're doing it in a way that tries to mitigate climate risk. So it could be a good thing. It could mean that we move towards an era of more action and less talk. But at the moment, that's not looking particularly hopeful.
There's something so idiotic about doing the right thing and being too scared to say it.
There is. And I think, we're seeing a lot of idiotic responses to what's happening in the United States at the moment. And this turn away from climate action is really particularly short-sighted. The fact that there is a political regime in the United States that is heavily supported by the fossil fuel industry doesn't change the fact that climate change is happening and that it is a material financial risk. And so, the current actions that these kinds of entities are taking are very politically expedient for them in the short term, but they're shoring up huge amounts of economic pain for us in the medium and long term, and really just emphasizing how extraordinarily badly designed our financial system is to deal with those kind of existential risks.
I suppose the point you're making is that climate change doesn't just stop because of politics.
Not at all. Absolutely not. And, interestingly as well, there are many, many very thorough surveys and sort of polls that show that the vast majority of Americans are actually very concerned about climate change. Unsurprisingly, tens of millions of them have had enormous impacts from climate change already. But it's not the most immediate voting issue. They vote for politicians on other grounds, on what they feel are more urgent, more immediate grounds like immigration and so on. So it's not as if the American public, doesn't think that climate change is a problem, but they now have in power in the White House someone who is completely enthralled to the oil and gas industry. It's really quite distressing to see all the kind of environmental protections that are already being rolled back in the United States. And at the end of the day, that is not going to benefit any of the people who voted for Donald Trump.
Is this just about... So, okay, they're the culture wars in the US that can be caught. Two different groups, different views on things like climate change. I realize that sort of going against the American president if you invest in the United States is quite a scary thing to do. Is the problem they're actually scared of some kind of punishment from Trump, or they're just trying to sort of read the room in a way? I mean, I suppose the greater question is, would he actually punish them? And there is some evidence, we saw it in Florida and Disney, there is some evidence that corporates can get drawn into these things and can never get out of it.
Well, I think certainly one of the things that's motivated BlackRock's very, very dramatic backtrack. If you remember 5 or 6 years ago, Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, made global headlines when he sent his annual letter to shareholders telling them how important an issue climate change was. They have very rapidly pulled back because Republican states have been suing them, saying that they are not allowed, that it's illegal for them to take issues like climate change into account in their investment decision making. State pension funds have been withdrawing money from investments in entities like BlackRock. So it's had a very real financial impact on them. So that is, I suppose, about the most effective punishment you can levy on a financial institution is punishing it financially. So, the Trump regime, or the Trump and the Republican regime in the United States, has a lot of power to put pressure on companies that it believes are, acting in a way that's contrary to the principles that Trump is governing by. But as I say, it's a short-term situation. It's a short-term kind of reaction that is going to do nothing in terms of our medium and long-term need, desperate, urgent need to tackle climate risk. Insurance companies in America are not insuring ordinary people against climate events. That's a massive financial implication for the American economy. But insurance companies are, also kind of kowtowing to the Trump regime.
Tracy Davies, thanks very much indeed, Executive Director at Just Share.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025.
7 minutes to 7, the time. I was asking if you have any memories of handling a Krugerrand, and if you have a long memory, some of the noise coming out of the White House threatening action, even sanctions against South Africa, might remind you just a little bit of what happened during the sort of end of apartheid, 1985 or so. The US, after quite a long political fight there, finally instituted sanctions against South Africa. One of the more interesting features about it was a ban on Krugerrands, and Krugerrands can hold a special place in a portfolio for some people because they're a way to actually own and control gold. As you know, in many places you can't actually own gold yourself in some places, and a Krugerrand is one way around that. Rael Demby is the CEO of the South African Gold Coin Exchange and the Scoin Group. Rael, good evening to you. Krugerrand's quite a strange investment in a way. It's a coin, it's made out of gold. They hold their value, I suppose. How important are they as an investment tool nowadays?
Good evening, Stephen, and happy World Radio Day. We certainly don't think they're too strange, but I could imagine in this world being online and digital and calling up a broker for some shares, actually holding a gold coin, a Krugerrand, taking it home with you, putting it under your pillow, gives a lot of people a lot of comfort. And at the moment, as we can see, the gold price is going a bit wild. The rand dollar is weakening. So the rand hedge, that is a South African gold Krugerrand, is over 57,000 rand today. And the first one ever launched in 1967 was 27 rand. So it's okay to keep some close by.
Okay, Rael. I did expect you to do some selling. How many of them are traded? I mean, are they traded very often?
Of course, there's thousands traded, even on the stock exchange, in all of our stores and around the world. The Krugerrand is the most popular gold bullion coin that's ever been made. From 67 to 85 it was. And then, as you said, there were sanctions, and the rest of the world could not get their hands on Krugerrands. And other countries, Canada Maple Leaf, American Eagle, etc., created their own for personal use. So thousands are being traded all the time, and fortunately lots of South Africans still have some.
Are you seeing a lot more demand at the moment because the gold price is so high? I mean, it would make sense that, what's under your pillow is increasing in value?
Of course, absolutely. We've seen a big excitement, but also there's a lot of fear and uncertainty at the moment. People want to have something tangible and nearby them. But as you can see, when there's uncertainty and the rest of the world sort of shakes, or when America sneezes, then maybe the other markets around the world can catch a cold. But gold tends to go the other way.
It's just really, it's just the fact that it's a way of holding gold that gives it its power, right?
Of course, you can buy gold ETFs, you can buy exposure to gold, but there's something quite wonderful about owning the physical asset, storing it safely, and like they say, if you don't hold it, you don't own it. So, there's an angle to keep some nearby or in a store just safe, and in times of need, instant liquidity, gold has stood the test of time, and it's proving to be exciting for new buyers and some old generations, estates, larger collections are obviously finding this the best time ever to sell at the all-time high. So there's a lot of action on buying and selling at the moment.
If Trump did ban them as part of broader measures, I mean, I don't know if that would happen, but I presume that might reduce demand?
It would. It would be pretty crazy if that did happen. There are other bullion options around the world, so that sort of limited mintage and scarcity factor that did happen in 85 onwards would be different this time. I hope this won't happen in our game, but sure, if the demand reduced, it would obviously inject a lot of excitement, and who knows if a 2025 Krugerrand would be a very special coin in 50 years' time.
Are they still being made?
Of course, sure. We just came back from the Berlin World Money Fair, where the biggest mints from around the world showcased their coins. There are mints around the world creating beautiful pieces of art on coins, as well as bullion coins and bars and even silver. It's buoyant. It's still there. Gold is the original money. This is the money show, and the first ever coin was a little tiny speck of gold. So gold has been around for 6,000 years and will continue to be minted and made into wonderful coins. And we are here to buy and sell.
Rael, thank you. That's enough selling. Rael Demby is the CEO of the South African Gold Coin Exchange and the Scoin shop. I mean, just an interesting way of sort of looking after money, I suppose, and it does tell you how important the gold price is, and we sometimes forget the impact of a gold price. I mean, one of the reasons we've seen so much illegal mining in the last 2 years is because the gold price has been so high. Doing certain things seemed ridiculous. Now, suddenly it makes a lot of sense because the gold price is quite so high. We will talk to you, this is a strange thing to say, we will talk to you about radio in just a moment. 80% of South Africans listen to the radio on a regular basis. You're obviously one of them. Just the way in which we do it, the way in which you get it is changing. It is World Radio Day. Siphumelele Zondi will be talking about that in a couple of moments. You with The Money Show, 7 o'clock.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
7 minutes after 7. Good evening. Welcome to the program. Welcome to the second hour. Good to hear from you tonight. Suggestions on how to spend a good retirement. Neil Froneman is finally retiring. I'm sure he's still got some work in him left. But what have you found during a retirement, or what have you seen someone in your family maybe on retirement that has really brought them some joy? 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567. What's the sort of, I suppose, the trick to a healthy retirement? Some, I know, it's outside interest, seeing people, that's a big thing. Seeing people your age, and I suspect some people tell me looking after grandchildren is the secret. Certainly keeps you young in all sorts of different ways. We'll talk about how to manage the investment situation around US President Donald Trump in just a moment. That'll be your investment school from 7:30. Also look at how smaller companies, if they are in debt, how to survive that. Can actually be very difficult, very scary moment for smaller companies. I mean, those stats out last year, I couldn't believe them when I read through them again this afternoon from the Reserve Bank, suggesting, in fact, 49% of SMEs have debt that is too big for them to ever pay back. I mean, that's nearly half of the companies now. Smaller companies are going to have to go bust. That's basically what that means. That is a frightening, frightening number. Maybe you're one of them. Perhaps you'd like to tell us how you got there.
The Money Show on 702.
Monday to Friday, 6 to 8 p.m.
Well, World Radio Day today. 80% of people in this country, you're one of them, consume radio on a regular basis. But the way that digital media works has changed how we consume radio. Doesn't seem to have actually completely disrupted it, though. Siphumelele Zondi, our tech expert, he's been conducting some academic research into how radio has been changed by digital media. Siphumelele, good evening. So many people in South Africa still listen to the radio. If you walk around, if you drive around, you'll see people with an earphone in their ears, often coming from their phone. and they're still listening to the radio. Siphumelelo, are you with us? All right, not sure what's happened to Siphumelelo Zondi there. Strange thing to happen. Second time this show, but very odd. Can't seem to hear him at the moment. Let's see if we're able to just continue that conversation with him and just see what the situation is. But certainly a very interesting thing to discuss. I mean, this is what still happens in the digital era. So let's just see if we're able to continue with him and put him and just sort of get a sense of how radio has changed over the years. I'll tell you one thing that's changed. Is there was a time when everyone was on a landline. The landline always worked. Now, of course, things are very, very different because so many calls are on cell phones. And you say to someone, get a landline, they sort of look at you. You can't blame them. Who has a cell phone nowadays, a landline nowadays? I think Siphumelelo back with us now. Siphumelelo, there you are. Good evening.
Hello. It did cut as we were doing the intro. Hello.
Okay. Why are so many of us still listening to radio? And that's despite having all the music in the world on your phone.
I suppose radio is always the companion that you can have in the background, right? It's different from other medium, like, for example, where think about print media, where you'd have to sit down and spend time and focus on just that one thing. Television has the viewing aspect that's also necessary for you to be in the room and listen. Whereas with radio, as you drive, it's playing in the background. As you do whatever you're doing in the home, as you gardening, as you're washing the car, it's playing in the background. So it doesn't need you to sit down and be doing that one thing. It can be a companion that gives you information as you are doing other things as well. Sometimes it can just play in the background while you're focusing or partially focusing on other things. So I suppose it's the nature of what it enables you to do as opposed to fully concentrating on it.
Do you think there'll be a time when that falls away, when digital media just fully takes over?
I believe where we are now is a space where I'm not sure about digital media fully taking over because we're in a hybrid space right now where there are podcasts, for example, that people sometimes dive into and then they go back to radio. But I also think that radio stations and radio programs like conversations like these, for example, that you sometimes find even outside the live format, if you've missed it or if you want to go back and engage with the conversation, you can pull away or you can stash it for later and listen to it on a podcast format later on, which then brings you back to the conversation that took place on radio or brings you back to radio where you might want to listen to other conversations in future. The fact that you can now pull into it in the live format, pull out, listen to a conversation later, carry on the conversation even on digital platforms at a later stage means that radio is probably going to last a lot longer. It's just that now it multiplies the spaces where it actually lives.
The thing about radio, though, is that it's live. I mean, I've sat in an Uber with someone I've never met before. And yes, you've had the sort of usual Uber discussion. And then something happens on the radio and you're both suddenly like, oh wow. And, this is not, a radio drama. This is a live conversation. I remember it once happening on Breakfast in 702. I was on the way in. Kolani Gwala was on the radio. And this just the most amazing moment happened where, a spokesperson refused to conduct the interview in English to make a political point. And we were both, I was in the parking lot by then. And I refused to get out of the car because I wanted to know how it was going to finish. And he refused to let me because he knew I needed to know. I mean, you get those moments.
Well, yes, you can't get those moments on any other medium, right? Because it has to be live. Yes, you can experience it later, but you're experiencing it after everybody else has experienced it in the moment, and because everybody else will be talking about it. So radio, I suppose, you get to know about it first. It can't really be repeated, but it can be played at a later stage. So that's the beauty of the live nature of things. And the fact that if you've missed the liveness of it, I suppose these days you can always go online and find it at a later stage and see what everybody else is talking about. That's if the radio platform itself has decided to upload it at a later stage. But it hooks you because of that live nature of it.
Where so many people, can tell their own stories, they have their own devices to do it. What should people on the radio be doing to keep audiences then?
I suppose what digital media allows the public to do is to tell stories that radio broadcasters can't get to first. I think about, for example, when floods happen. You can't show that on radio. You can't. And sometimes even broadcasters aren't there, but broadcasters can then later on go and find out from the people about their experiences and find out about the corners that they probably otherwise wouldn't even know about. So what actually needs to happen now is that almost a relationship between these digital platforms and a bigger relationship between the broadcaster and the person who in the olden days would only be the audience, who's now also become the creator of information and what happens in their lives, almost like a collaboration of sorts between the audience and the broadcaster in bringing information to the rest of the world that would otherwise not happen.
This year's theme for World Radio Day is climate change, and I imagine that radio does quite a lot. It doesn't just tell people about it, it often hosts the debates around climate change.
Totally, and it also would ask for accountability as well from lawmakers, from leaders who otherwise would not be taking these issues seriously. Think about what happens in the United States as, for example, Donald Trump is pulling out of all sorts of things as well. And it's the radio broadcasters and their professionalism as well, because let's not take that for granted. Yes, everybody has the tool, but not everybody has almost the skill to, you spoke about Olane Gwala now, and the skill that he had to engage his audiences at a time. People like yourselves who have that skill to hold people to account, to bring these stories to the fore, and to ask the relevant questions and the right kind of questions as well, even in this digital era.
Younger people, are they still listening to the radio? I mean, podcasts, yes. I mean, I don't want to talk bad about competition, but when I listen to a podcast, I find it takes quite a long time to get to the point. I know younger people are also, and you know, anyone with children knows this, when a child first makes a phone call, they actually look for the picture because that's what they're used to. They're used to everything having a picture. So, I mean, it's quite a lot of work to keep them going, keep them hooked onto it.
It almost needs formatting to be re-engineered, right, in order to appeal to all those senses that want quick information, which then means if you are trying to hook that younger audience who is used to almost small bite information on various digital platforms, you're going to have to be almost creative in how you can get that information to them while you're getting the bigger information to them as well. But they're still listening to radio, hence 80% of South Africans still listen to radio today. I was actually in an auditorium with young people today, and I asked how many listen to radio, and almost every hand in the room went up.
Sure. Siphumelele, thank you. Siphumelele Zondi, tech expert, been looking at some research on the subject. Happy Radio Day.
702.
702.
Stephen is on X.
At Stephen Grootes.
Small Business Focus is brought to you by Capitec. No matter the size of your business, Capitec's got you. You know how often we have conversations about the problems that smaller firms have in getting capital, simply getting enough money. And I was astonished to read again today the Reserve Bank saying that 49% of SMEs have debt that is too big for them to ever pay back. And you can just imagine all of the knock-on effects of that. They can't pay their workers, they can't pay their suppliers, business gets harder and harder, and you just go down this kind of nightmare of disaster. Lonqedo Ntwentwe is the Managing Director at Vantage Advisory. Lonqedo, good evening, and thanks for your time. I mean, when you're in this situation, as a small business, it must be very scary, very difficult to get out of.
Good evening, Stephen. And look, those numbers, I must say, they're not surprising at all. We deal with SMEs on a day-to-day basis. And that is really, a state for any other entrepreneur out there that it becomes dark, of course. But however, I always say the fact that SMEs are at that point is the reflection of our economy as a country. We are projected to grow at 1%, 1.5%, just below 2%. So the knock-on effects of that have a huge role or impact to the SMEs. And we know they play a very important role in terms of creating jobs in the country. And the reason being for that, again, Stephen, is because to grow your businesses, of course, you need funding. And cash flow is at the heart of all of this. Entrepreneurs, for them to really fund their projects, you need either three sources of funding. It's either equity, where you bring in shareholders or investors. And we know the state of investment in South Africa, that it's not that good. That's why we don't have so many unicorns out there. And then the other option, of course, as an entrepreneur is for you just to use your personal savings, of which I'm not sure if that is really the wisest decision. And then the other option, of course, is to get into debt, is to raise debt and fund your operations and fund your projects. So that is where most of the SMEs are at, is to say, how do we fund our operations? Huge issues again, with some of the SMEs, especially that they do business with government as a result of either late payment. Therefore, then one has to go and try to raise funding somewhere else.
When you're in this kind of debt hole, where do you need to start? And I suppose you need to start by working out how much money you actually owe.
Yeah, I always say the first that if you're already in it, right, is for us, it's always say first, I think, before you even get into it, make sure that you've got your business or you've structured your business in a way that it will be sustainable enough. You didn't put all your eggs in one business. But if you're already in debt, and this is what we pick up with most entrepreneurs, you have to reach out to the lenders or to the funders on time before it is too late. And that's why you have to renegotiate your debt terms, renegotiate either your repayment periods and other conditions, just to ensure that you get a better cash flow in relation to your business. But most entrepreneurs, they usually try to shy away from that discussion. It is a difficult discussion, of course, but any funder or any lender, also they've got an interest in a business that it has to succeed so that they get their capital back. If that discussion doesn't exist at all, then that's where it becomes extremely hard. However, we always say that before you even get into debt, make sure that you raise debt that you will deploy into projects that will generate revenue, not debt just to fund your day-to-day operations without a clear plan on how you will generate future revenue.
I suppose if you're looking at debt, you also need to pay back the high interest stuff first. You need to work out, you need to prioritize which debt needs to be paid back before the other debt.
No, absolutely. So in relation to debt, I think we have to be clear to SMEs that we're not saying all the debt is bad. There are a number of businesses that have grown as a result of they've raised good debt. They've deployed the debt into projects that are really showing positive future revenues for the business. However, those debts that have high interest cost, those are the ones that you really need to prioritize, or those ones that have or can put a threat into your operations. And the number of other debts, of course, you can always renegotiate. The principle in business is always you collect as much as you can, you delay to pay. This is what most big businesses, what they do anyway, so that it allows them to have that cash flow to maneuver. So that is the same as well as an SME, to say, look, which one will have a huge impact on my business or that can threaten the operations, which ones where I can have very good discussions, delay those periods, pay as much as you can, the ones that have got high interest cost.
And then obviously you need to try and keep your costs down. I mean, that's how you make as much money as you can. It does mean that you actually have to think quite carefully about how you manage your business and what you're spending your money on.
Bootstrapping in terms of really managing your costs is something that is very important. And Stephen will always say, any funder, before they fund any business, they will look at your balance sheet, they will look at your income statement. The expenses that are on the income statement, they say a lot about the behavior of the entrepreneur, not only just the business of the entrepreneur, because those are the decision makers, those are the people that decide where the money goes. So if you have unnecessary expenses really popping into your income statement, then any fund or any lender will be able to scrutinize that and say the character or the behavior of this entrepreneur is a bit worrisome. Same as when you look at the balance sheet, you look at your assets, you look at your liabilities. But the more you see some of these liabilities, loan to directors, that also say quite a lot. So that's why we always say, as much as, yes, you can bet on a horse, however, it's important that you look at the jockey themselves. So if the jockey is really not a good jockey, then, I mean, you're not going to go ahead and bet on that horse. So that's where the entrepreneurs themselves have to structure, have to be disciplined, have to manage their course well. In the long run, that behavior, the numbers, they speak for themselves.
Is there a point at which you should get professional advice on how to deal with this debt?
Having a business or being an entrepreneur is a journey. And so it's not something we usually say that you must travel that journey alone. You need a number of advisors next to you. You need accountants. You need lawyers next to you. And that is where now, even in terms of when you want to raise capital or there's a project, you need people that are well astute, that understand that, okay, this is how we can structure the debt for this business. This is how we can structure the balance sheet for this business so that we still have a room to borrow more. We still have a room to invite, external investors into the business. So that's where the experts come in, or the advisors really come in, is that you as an entrepreneur, focus on your operations, you're good at what you do. Sometimes you're not a financial expert. So that's where you need very good people next to you to surround you. And I know most of the time SMEs will say it's very expensive to get, advisors. However, some of these people, it's not about having them on your payroll on a monthly basis, but it's people that you can touch base to either on a quarterly basis, half-yearly basis, get that advice. In the long run, it does pay off.
Loncedo, thank you very much indeed. Loncedo Mtwentwe is the Managing Director at Vantage Advisory.
The Money Show.
Investment School.
When we talk about investing at the moment, there's really only one name that just keeps coming up. It doesn't really matter where you are, what you're even doing, who you're thinking about, what you're thinking about. It all comes down to the US President Donald Trump. And if you consider that during the election campaign, he said the most beautiful word in the English dictionary was the word tariffs. And since he's come into power, he's clearly using them and the threat of them. You can imagine how difficult it is to actually invest. At the same time, certain certainties, if I can use that expression, around artificial intelligence, about what was going to move, have been shaken somewhat. If you consider what happened with the release of the DeepSeek model, you can understand how everything has changed. And in the middle of all of that, you have the fact that we find ourselves in the crosshair of the Trump administration in a way I think was considered very unlikely. Well, to talk you through it all on Investment School tonight, Temoso Musi is an investment analyst at 361 Asset Management and part of the PPS Managed Fund Investment Team. Temoso, good evening. Thanks so much for coming in tonight.
Good evening, Stephen, and good evening to your listeners. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So when you're thinking of investing during a time of Trump, and a lot's changing really very quickly. I mean, he's going to try and declare peace in Ukraine soon. I mean, where do you even start? Obviously, you need quite a cool head at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So I think that's what you're saying is very important because, with Trump and, his rhetoric around trade policy and, there has been a lot of uncertainty that's been introduced into the markets. It's very hard to sort of adequately state what is Trump's next move going to be. And with uncertainty comes a lot of market volatility. We've seen the rand be quite volatile since the start of the year, and it's very difficult sort of to navigate that. And the answer of how do you navigate that is to sort of try and position yourself to be as flexible and as agile as you possibly can. It's more of consistently and actively observing what's going to happen and taking every piece of new information and putting it together, and doing that while navigating. And when I say that, that sort of leads to the idea of trying to be diversified as much as one can, because with diversification, you sort of have more leeway to navigate through these times of uncertainty.
I mean, you talk about moving quickly, and obviously that makes complete sense. Often to get a real return, you need to stay in a stock for quite a long time. So, I mean, just the fact that you now have to have this agility as well could actually really hurt returns over a 5-year or over a 4-year period.
Yeah, so that's quite interesting. It's quite an interesting point. So with diversification, it's also important to be very selective on the type of companies that you're investing in. I think that, in an environment like this one, how it would differ to an environment, let's say, compared to last year, is that you should appreciate that there's going to be some market volatility. But that does not necessarily mean that there is no opportunity. Here in South Africa, we are very sort of fortunate as a South African investor that, looking at the JSE, we have 50% of the stocks which are directly sort of linked to the South African economy. And the other 50%, has a combination of, commodity companies and, other sort of general enterprises, which have a very strong rand hedge component to that, So with that, the JSE is quite diverse, and we do have a lot of options to consider, based on how the market is moving and what type of risks are being introduced on a day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis and so forth. It's just very important to always keep in mind and always check the opportunity set. And, it's an iterative process. It's always going back, taking information and going back and reassessing the opportunities that are out there and trying to be agile enough to try and navigate through that.
And I suppose what you're saying is you can, to diversify, put some money into Naspers and Prosus and kind of keep it there because then you're exposed to China. You can put some money into some gold miners just because it's gold and because of where gold is at the moment. And you can put some other money into, to pick a stock off the top of my head, no, not Spar, ShopRite.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you've got it. That Naspers and Prosus. Tencent. Chinese tech as an investment theme has been doing quite well recently. So it looks like there's some opportunities there. And you mentioned the gold players. Again, with high levels of uncertainty and geopolitical risk, gold as an asset, usually serves as a safe haven. And we've seen the gold price, go to all-time highs over the last 3 weeks continuously. And it's around 2,900 now, could go to 3,000. And, there is opportunities, just that you have to be quite selective and smart about it. And you're actually forced to do your homework and forced to take an active approach to try and survive and go through this.
When Trump talks and he talks about tariffs against South Africa, they haven't come yet, but at some point I suspect they may. What does that do to investor sentiment towards South Africa? What does it do to the currency? We sort of see some effects, but I don't think it's all been priced in yet.
So that's a good point. It's a good question. It's definitely something that you should consider, right? It's when it comes to investing, it's always about playing with scenarios and asking yourself these sort of questions. And, you do bring an interesting question, what happens if Trump does become more, aggressive to South Africa and trade policies? We do have a trade partnership with the US, AGOA, and that's, set to come to expiration this year. That's something that we're checking. So, one does need to look out for those sort of things. And to answer your question, yes, it won't be good. But again, we in South Africa, as a South African investor, we do have the opportunity to sort of diversify that, South African specific risk. But generally, in terms of what it would do for sentiment, it won't be that good for sentiment. The rand could weaken further. And as I did say, the rand is now at about 18 Rand 50. When Trump started his aggressive rhetoric and, there was a lot of fear that was going through the markets, we saw the rand go to levels, past in the 19 range. So as for now, I do think that the rand could fluctuate between, 1850 and 19 rands. And, there is a risk that it could go higher. But as you said, that hasn't been priced in yet. And there hasn't been any rhetoric yet on on Trump, trying to be very aggressive on South Africa and our trade relationship with the US.
Are there certain sectors, certain South African stocks that are likely to be more resilient? I mean, let's just put gold into a separate box for just a moment.
Sure.
And let's forget about platinum. But are there certain stocks or sectors that you can see, actually, you're going to get good value here almost no matter what happens?
Sure. So, people usually laugh at me on this. So I cover a lot of small cap companies and I love small businesses. And, generally, as a basket, the small caps usually don't perform well in an environment like this because with high uncertainty, you have lower sentiment, and these small caps usually just sell off altogether. But within that basket of small caps, now there are a few sort of businesses that are actually well positioned to outperform and to do well. And you do have the benefit of a lot of these small cap companies aggressively selling off through sentiment, and they trade at compelling valuations. And if one does the homework and becomes quite selective on these small cap stocks, you'll find that a lot of them have actually done a lot of work to diversify the operations to be sort of insulated from SA specific risk, and they can do that by having a very strong export component in their business to various regions. And that can allow these small cap businesses to have strong, sustainable earnings through the cycle and could do well within this environment, and they could sort of recover their valuations. So that is something that I've been thinking about, and I believe. But time will tell. As I said, the small caps have sold off quite a bit. So yeah, we should see that. And so those sort of yeah.
I mean, there's some companies that have been doing very strongly for a while, and because of the sector they're in, and I think, for example, of Dis-Chem and Clicks, right? Sort of two rivals in a way. Well-run businesses. Share price have been doing very nicely, very consistently. Yes, they'll import some of their stuff, but they are South African-based and focused. I mean, I kind of wonder if a stock like that, some of the retailers, Boxer maybe, just because of everything that's happening, because they're based here, they're not going to be hurt too much by what happens overseas, I'd like to think, because they're selling stuff to South Africans, and a lot of that stuff is made here or in China, and so they'll be fine. I mean, they're kind of almost, are they Trump-averse, or am I being a little naive?
Yeah, but I don't think that you're being too naive. I think, again, it all depends on the strength of the consumer. These are obviously, very consumer-facing businesses, and yeah, it will time will tell. But I do think that one aspect that we should consider is that, if depending on the Trump rhetoric, that has or Trump policies, that has a direct effect on the interest rates, so if rates continue to stay higher for longer, the consumer could remain under pressure. And, with that, the retailers should definitely be affected.
I mean, this is a kind of moment for the active investor, isn't it? I mean, this is a moment for people who are very interested in it, need to move quickly, need to watch the news flow. I mean, this is the kind of moment for that person.
Absolutely. I think this is where, the active manager should come and try and shine. This gives, a lot of opportunity, and it's very exciting, because, the active managers who are very nimble and flexible, like ourselves at 361 and the PPS managed funds, we're able to sort of swing and move the portfolios in a manner that allows us to react to sort of macroeconomic shocks, and protect capital and strive to try and grow our returns.
We're speaking to Temoso Musi tonight, investment analyst at 361 Asset Management, part of the PPS Managed Fund investment team. We're talking about how to survive investing in a time of Trump. Some defensive stock picking. That's next on The Money Show.
The Money Show.
Investment School.
Investment School inevitably tonight discussing how to survive the trade turmoil caused by US President Donald Trump. You know the number, 011-883-0702, 021-446-0567. Tomoso Musi is an investment analyst at 361 Asset Management, part of the PPS Managed Fund investment team as well. Tomoso, there's a thing such as defensive stock picking, and there are some stocks where you can see there's going to be a lot of growth here. So there's going to be infrastructure spending in South Africa. Eskom's load shedding is over. All of those things. What kind of stocks would you be looking at there?
Sure. So, again, just to expand on what you've said about Eskom, I think looking at Eskom, right, they now sort of in a position where they're almost forced to and committed to, in fact, to invest, have a substantial amount of investment directed towards, the transmission infrastructure. So we've been in a position where they've done quite a good job to invest and sort of reboot up their generation assets to generate electricity. Now it comes the time to actually take that generation and transmit it, and the grid needs to be upgraded in order to achieve that, right? So part of Eskom's, transmission development plan is quite an extensive plan, and in that plan, it outlines that, Eskom needs to invest an enormous amount in terms of the cables that they need to sort of procure to transmit this electricity. And these cables, and this plan is set to run through from this year over the next 10 years. And it's interesting. Now, how does one play that? Well, there's a very interesting company that I think excites me quite, to be frank, and that's the company named Roinet. And Roinet is, is one of the biggest manufacturers of these sort of copper aluminium cables that are used for transmitting electricity. And, there's only 3 players in the market, and they're the one player that actually has a very strong balance sheet. And again, to navigate, uncertainty, having a strong balance sheet and little debt, gives you more ammo to deal with, any curveballs that can come into your operation. So I think Roinet is actually well positioned to benefit from the well-needed infrastructure spend that's going to come from Eskom.
So, you've got to look for things where there's going to be spending. I hate to say it, but we might start to see around the world a bit more spending on defense for various reasons. Some of those companies, if we can get exposure to them, are places to be.
Well, funny that you should say that, because Roinet also has, the second biggest segment in their operations is a defense business. And, just if I could just speak on that, it's very interesting. And again, this goes to the quality of management that's needed and how you can find decent opportunities in the small cap space. So Roinet has a very strong defense business. For a number of years, they were quite reliant on the South African National Defence Force. About 70% of all their orders was coming from them. And, from 2019 or so, orders had dropped and this business had been struggling. And since then, management has done a magnificent job to sort of change the whole business model within that defense capability, and that allowed them, and through acquisitions, that has also allowed them to now have a very strong export capability. So these guys now, they export to the Middle East, they export to Southeast Asia, a lot of it in India, in Europe. And, these are all nations who are actually quite committed to increase the amount of spend towards defense. And, now, as I said, Roinet had about 70% of the defense orders coming from SANDF. That has now changed to about 30 to 20% that's reliant on, the SA market. And so, yeah.
Obviously, you've got to sort of play it quite carefully. I suppose the other problem when you're trying to look at investing in this moment is you don't really know what's going to happen in sort of 3 years and 48 weeks now time, right? So Trump might be followed by someone like him, could be J.D. Vance, Trump might have another go for another term. Who knows? It could be someone completely different. I think American politics swings quite dramatically, and we might see a big swing. So you've got to also keep an eye on the kind of longer term, right? You've got to sort of work out what could happen next in terms of making a good play over the medium to longer term period.
For sure. I mean, that's. I'm glad that you bring that up. It's very important to have sort of a defined investment horizon. It shouldn't be too short. It shouldn't be too long, but it should be quite sensible enough to. And again, with market uncertainty, that does become a bit difficult, right? And that's why I feel like stock selection is key, because you're trying to find businesses that are likely to sustain a decent run of earnings over a set horizon. And that is very difficult to do, but the best that one can do is, go through the information that exists and, have a sort of a process where you compare different companies and different prospects across your investment pool. And, with time, you can find what you think is the best. And if within time, things change a bit, again, active managers, we're agile and we're flexible, and we can shift and try to find the best set of stocks that are likely to best perform over the medium to long term.
There's some people who are predicting a huge boom in the United States. I'm not an economics expert, but I'm not so sure. So some people are just taking all the money they can and putting that in the US. Is that wise at this stage?
Sure, it's hard to say. The dollar. If I just look at the dollar right now, if you look at the dollar index, that is a bit elevated, and that there's been a lot of dollar strength with Trump's "Put America First" policy. I think the best thing that one can do is just again assess the risk, understand what's happening now, and understand the various scenarios that are going to be able to come. Just looking at interest rates, that's one of the biggest ones. Are interest rates going to stay high for longer? What's going to happen? It's a bit hard to say. And again, with Trump, he's quite the volatile personality, and things can go anywhere. So at this stage, it's hard to say if that is the wise decision, purely because again, on what basis, on what horizon are we looking at? Listen. The U.S. has about a fiscal deficit of 6%. That's quite high for a developed country. So I think that there is room for the dollar to weaken in the short to long term.
Tamoso, thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Tamoso Morsi, investment analyst at 361 Asset Management, part of the PPS Managed Fund Investment Team on Investment School tonight.